Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another fabulous episode of the Kelly Berger podcast. I'm Kelly Berger, the Kelly Berger who puts the Kelly Berger into the podcast. And today we are on episode number 17, which I guess is the age where, like in Germany and France, this podcast can drink and smoke. So we're going to have some extra fun with this one. And today is also a very special occasion because today is a historic occasion because today on this podcast, we have our first quote unquote civilian interview, which is a comic term for a person who's not a comedian, but this guy is very well known in the comedy community. I would consider him like the Minneapolis comedy historian. Keep it going for Patrick Strait.
Hey, thank you. Look at that, man. I appreciate it. I didn't know I was going to be the barely legal episode. That's awesome.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. Yeah.
Cool, man. No, appreciate you having me.
Yeah, Patrick, you've been active in the, or at least involved in the Minneapolis comedy scene for quite a while, and you've written like a whole book about it.
I have, yes. I've been writing about the Twin Cities comedy scene now for probably about 16 years or so for different publications in town. City Pages and Star Tribune and Racket and Growler and a whole bunch of others. But and then I actually started my own site, which is mncomedy.com, which is really kind of gives me the chance to kind of dig a little bit deeper and talk about some of the comics and the scene and things like that. And then, yes, to your point, I wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago for the Minnesota Historical Society called Funny Thing About Minnesota. That's all about the history of Twin Cities comedy. And then actually I have another book that's going to be coming out here next year about the oral history of Acme Comedy Company. So yeah, I'm really, really been close to the comedy scene for a long time. Really proud to be a part of this scene. And no, I just love having the opportunity to chat with folks like yourself who I think really have kind of carried on that tradition and made it so great.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And what sort of got you interested in like the Minneapolis comedy? Was it like your first trip to Acme or House of Comedy?
So you know what it was I moved out to Minnesota from Michigan in like 2007. And at that point, I had never been around like a comedy scene. I mean, I'd seen comedy, I'd been to a comedy club before, but like I really hadn't been around like a whole scene. And so I remember I did go to a show at Acme. I remember when I first moved here and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And then I remember I went back to an open mic and, to me, I didn't really understand, or I didn't really know the difference between, like the big shows you see on like a Saturday night and like the open mic. So like to me, and Acme is, for those who aren't familiar, Acme pulls a really great crowd for their open mics too. So you see this crowd that's still there. And so to me, everybody who was performing was still like, that's a big deal. Like that's a real comedian. So seeing all these people and then seeing them around town, it was kind of almost like this, like, wow, like there's all these people who do comedy. That's so crazy. Like I didn't know that, that's how you get into it is you hit open mics and you start working your way up. And so, as I just started going to more shows and as I started getting a little bit more familiar, I just kind of got to a point where I was like, I think that there's a lot more here and there's a lot of individuals. So I think that could really help to share their story and get that out there. And so that's what I started doing. There really wasn't a lot of that when I first started writing about Twin Cities comedy. There was a little bit here and there, especially for like the bigger shows. If like, there's a theater show or like somebody who's nationally touring, but not like your day-to-days. There wasn't anybody out there giving the love to Kelly Berger like there should have been. So that's where I came in, to be able to kind of
spot for that shout out.
Hey, anytime. I'm going to do it like 6-7 times.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned like the Acme open mic because Acme is a very special open mic. It's sort of like Acme's open mic is like the sort of represent. It sort of feels like the sort of comedy like you watch. You feel like, oh, this is what comedy is going to be all the time. And then you go to other open mics and you're like, nope, this is still a hard grind.
Yes. It's funny because for I would say maybe like, 15 minutes or so, I was like really like, oh, maybe I should get into this. Maybe I should do comedy. And so I did a couple of mics. I did 2 mics at Acme. And then I was like, to your point, I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. Like I did fine. It wasn't like I was like, it's lighting the world on fire, but it was fine. And then I went to a place called Galactic Pizza in town. And I went to their open mic. Yes. And it was funny because, I didn't have any point of reference. So, coming off of Acme, which to me, that's what open mic comedy is like. And I went to Galactic Pizza and it was like, oh my God, like this is real different, and it was, and obviously not to speak disparagingly because there's a lot of open mics that, they're grinding, but it was it was night and day, man. I mean, it was definitely, much smaller audience, I'll say. I mean, much, just more DIY. And so that was the first time I think I really understood that there was levels to the open mics and things like that. But at the same time, it was cool to see that there was such a DIY culture, people who were putting on these shows and doing open mics, and not just, you didn't have to just go to the clubs if you were looking for stage time. That was kind of a cool awakening for me.
Yep. And yeah, I enjoyed Galactic Pizzas. It was a real practice mic. Was when you went there, was Mike Linden hosting it?
I believe so, actually. Yeah, I think that is who was hosting it.
Yeah, he was a great host. He's also more active in the improv crowd. Like, I remember his says he would just improv between each comic and kept a good flow to it.
Totally. No, I mean, it was great. I mean, like I said, it was, once you, especially if you're, for those listening, if you're not familiar with the Twin Cities scene, there were some mics that almost feel like were like rites of passage. I mean, you had that, you had like I don't know, were you doing it? Were you in the scene when the like the Grumpy's mic was going?
Yes, I remember Grumpy's.
Yes, the Death Comedy Jam. And like that was wild. And I mean, you had some mics that like they may not have been quote unquote good from a standpoint of like the audience or anything like that, but it was good, I think, especially, and I can't speak to this as much, but if you were trying to come up as a comic to get those experiences, it almost kind of gave you that street cred where it was like, okay, this guy really does want to be a comic, or she really is interested in being in the scene, even when it's less than glamorous. So no, I think there's a lot of mics like that are cool.
Yeah, there's some mics where the audience, you have to win over the audience, and you're sort of like surprised, and they're not automatically tuned in. You got to win them over, which is great practice for road gigs. Like, I did a couple down in Texas where the gig is like it's advertised, but only like a family showed up for like dinner, and then they got in a fight with the waiter.
Yes, which, I mean, that nobody's more excited for comedy than a family that is on the brink of imploding. They want to hear Kelly's hot 7 minutes about, like what's the deal with airline food. That's what they're there for.
Yeah. And yeah, you wrote this great book about the Minneapolis comedy scene. Darren read it. I didn't yet. Sorry about that. So no spoilers. I'm going to read it
I'll talk to Darren then.
It's good.
Thank you, Darren. I appreciate that.
I especially really enjoyed learning about the early 80s when it came to comedy.
Thank you.
And just how much like Louis Anderson was part of that scene, and I just learned who Scott Hansen was the day before I bought your book. So getting to learn about him through a different medium other than just talk to the people at work was really, really cool.
Definitely. No, I mean,
what time frame does the book take place? Like from the early 80s to late 90s to now?
Yeah, so I mean, the book takes place, funny thing about Minnesota, it takes place from, the kind of kickoff, which was late 70s, which is really when it kind of first started having its there was little bits and pieces. I think it was like 1979. It wasn't really a scene even at that point, because it was one of those things where, if you wanted to do comedy, or if you wanted to see comedy outside of seeing it on TV, seeing Bob Hope, or seeing, Newhart, or, Johnny Carson, or anybody like that, outside of seeing those guys on TV, you either had to be like in New York or you had to be in LA. So really, like, you didn't have comedy clubs or comedy rooms or mics that you'd go into in the Midwest. And then actually there was a bar in town called Mickey Finn's, and one of their bartenders went out west. He went to California for vacation, saw a show, came back, and was like, oh, this comedy thing is cool, we should do it. And so they ended up having like a contest, and that was kind of the first, how they got things going. So, I mean, it was essentially a very, very glorified open mic, but it was like a funniest person contest. And then it kind of built out from there. So to answer your question, Kelly, I mean, it was late 70s from that kind of initial contest all the way up through, I would say, really through the boom period of the 80s and into I call it the bubble burst period of probably about the mid 90s.
Yep. And also in your book, you talk about the famous five. I think I can name three of them. There's Louis Anderson, Scott Hansen, Wild Bill Bauer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
and those can you name the other two, Darren? You read the book.
Oh, it's been more than a week, so some of that information is gone at this point.
I'll let it slide. No, the other two, there was a guy named Jeff Turbino, who he's down in Florida now, And another gentleman named Alex Cole, who actually is back in town now. He's actually in Minnesota, and he doesn't do a lot. He doesn't perform a lot anymore, but you'll still see him every once in a while show up at a show, or you'll see him in the back of the club, and it's a pretty big deal because I mean there was a time where Alex Cole was as big of a deal as it got. Like if you saw Alex Cole walk in during a show, it was like celebrity sighting. So it's still cool to see him around, but sadly, Alex and Jeff are the only two guys of that five that are left. The other guys, unfortunately, have passed. Scott and Louie both passed. I think it's been about 2.5 years since Louie passed. And I think it's been right around maybe a little more than since. Yeah, and maybe pretty close to that when Scott passed as well, probably about 2. So I think they were very close together, which is sad. And then unfortunately, Wild Bill he passed before I ever got the chance to write the book, but his son, Patrick Bauer, actually was a comic on the scene for a long time. So I got the chance to chat with him and kind of relive some of those memories of his dad. And yeah, another great guy there's stories on stories about Wild Bill in the Twin Cities scene.
Yep. I've seen Patrick many times. He's a really good comic.
Yeah. No, Patrick was awesome. And he was a lot of fun to talk to because, I mean, from a comic standpoint, but then from the personal standpoint, it just felt kind of cool to see how this person had shaped his life in all facets. So yeah, no, Pat's a great guy. I was really happy I got to chat with him.
And I watched another interview with you. You said this great quote about the Minneapolis comedy scene. You said Minnesota contributed as much to stand-up comedy as Prince did to music.
Yes, which is probably extremely overstepping, but I believe it. I mean, I stand by it. And what I mean by that is, maybe not in terms of overarching fame. I don't know that there was people who were, still coming out to celebrate every year on the site of the Death Comedy Jam where Grumpy's got torn down like they do at Paisley Park. But, I think in terms of your, the creativity, I think the talent that came out of here was definitely, very influential on others outside of the Twin Cities scene. And then I think people from outside who saw Minnesota comedy, they started coming here because they wanted to be around that. Same way, like I said, to draw that comparison to Prince, people wanted to be around that creativity, that unique thought, that personality. And that's a lot of what the Twin Cities comedy scene was all about.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, once you leave Minneapolis, you realize quickly that it has something special.
That is what I've heard. I mean, Kelly, you can probably speak to that better than I know, talking to a lot of different comics, though, they say those things. I actually was talking to a guy, I'll name drop a little bit, for my new book. I was talking to a guy named Chad Daniels, and he was saying that, he got spoiled by the idea that he was like, oh, this is what comedy is. And then he goes, and then I would go up to, North Dakota, and it was like, oh my God, like this is not what I thought comedy was. I mean, just because, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, road gigs, man, you get rooms that are tough, and you get, they won't unplug the dartboard and turn off the TV, and you got to try to shout over people. So yeah, I mean, very different there. And then even, I was talking with Nick Swartzen about this, and he, was obviously the biggest deal in the world in Minnesota. When he first left for New York, he actually said that like he would get booed at comedy clubs. Like people would literally boo and just like not have anything to do with him. And he said the same thing. He was like, just the respect that you get from Twin Cities comedy crowds is a lot different and a lot better. And, I'm sure some of that's that Minnesota nice thing, but I think some of it's also the fact that, I think I'm gonna go ahead and stroke our egos. Like we are an audience and a group of people that really respect just performance and art forms. And we're going to let you work some stuff out. Even if Kelly, you make a joke and we're like, I don't know where he's going with this. We're going to let you take it down that path. Like we want to see where you're going with it. People aren't going to turn on you. They really want to at least give you that runway to see what you're going to do before they boo you out of the room. So that's good at least.
Yep. And I also want to add like Minneapolis performers, like they have the Minnesota nice that radiates off them on stage. So when they're on stage, you feel like I should really listen to this guy. He seems interested. I know many Minneapolis comics, they try to work to like they are happy with the audience who's there. Like in the other scenes, like if there's like a low turnout, some comics, they just sort of passive aggressively attack it, thinking like, oh, this should be bigger, and that just sort of sets a bad mood.
Yeah, I just turn this around and start asking you in your own podcast questions, Kelly. But I mean, like, what's your attitude on that? Because you're right. I mean, I have, and I've seen the occasional Twin Cities comic who maybe will fall into that trap. But you're right. Far and away, I think Twin Cities comics are appreciative of that. I have seen comics who, like you said, they feel like they'll mail it in. Like, oh, there's 12 people here, so I'm not gonna show up for you, or they'll make comments to be like, well, the show's only as good as you guys make it. And that's always irritated me because it's like, hey man, they still paid for this show. Maybe they at least showed up. They paid in their time at bare minimum. So I'm curious, like, what's your attitude? Like when you see a show and there's 8 people, there's 10 people, what do you feel like about that? Now I put you on the spot. You could be like, I hate it, but go for it.
I think right now it would make me feel sort of like the people who go see Furiosa, whether it's small amount of people who see it, but the people who come to see it, like, they're going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. No, man, I respect that. And I feel like that's the difference between the comics that really love comedy and the comics who want to be famous, or they want to do this to make money, because I think right away, if you love making people laugh, man, you can make 3 people laugh in a room and you're like, that was a fun show. And, Chad is a funny example. I remember years and years ago, I went to a, I can't remember what town it was. I want to say it was like Shakopee or somewhere out that way, in like a hotel. They tried to open a comedy club, and Chad was the first headliner they had in. And there was literally 7 people in the crowd. And he showed up and he put on a show like he was doing a theater. Like he might as well have had 600 people in there. He went for 45 minutes. He's doing crowd work. He was doing all of his polished stuff. Like it was really fun. And like that, to me, that says a lot about a performer.
Yep. And in Minneapolis, I learned how to do crowd work really well, especially at the infamous open mic Willie's in Coon Rapids.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like Grumpy's and Willie's, those are like the 2 clubs that sort of like shaped my comedy DNA.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm trying to think, is Willie's still really? I think Willie's reopened, didn't it? I can't remember. But no, that was a great room.
Change its name again. Like that bar has gone through so many identities because they always have to change their identity because for legal and crime reasons.
I understand that. Yes, it happens. I mean, that's the bar business as a whole, right? So.
Yep. And Grumpy's got like a great shout out with Ian Rhymes' documentary that came out during the pandemic about Grumpy's.
Yeah.
And that's like a great Minneapolis mic that deserves a big shout out.
Absolutely. No, and I'm glad you called out Ian's documentary, because that was a really fun documentary. And it was it feels like very much a moment in time he captured. I mean, it's the people, it's the personalities, it's just the overall feeling of it. And yeah, I mean, like I said, that was another room. It was a tough room from what I understand from, I didn't do comedy there, so I won't say it like I did, but it was a tough room to do comedy. But man, like if you showed up there and you were willing to put in the time, if you could handle that crowd, like you could handle doing comedy anywhere.
Yeah, it was a super tough room. It was like in a room that used to be like a garage for a hearse.
Yeah,
which is a good symbolism.
Yep. Oh, big time. Nothing's funnier than the ghosts floating around the garage.
Yep. And also it was the ultimate Minneapolis comedy hang. Like Brian Miller, he said like it was good. It was like Minneapolis comedy international waters. Like everyone from each section of the Minneapolis scenes integrated and got along there well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was definitely. It was the UN of Twin Cities comedy.
Mm-hmm. Like
it's the nicest thing that's ever been said about Grumpy's, but yeah.
Yep, and it's one of those few open mics that lasted for 15 years.
Yeah. At this point, if you can keep an open mic open for 4 weeks, I'm impressed sometimes. So yeah, 15 years is no joke.
Yeah, I kept mine going for 8 months.
That's impressive. Like that's really genuinely impressive, man. I mean, running an open mic, I mean, I don't have to tell you, but that's a grind, and I think especially when you look at what else is happening in town with other mics, and then seasonally, you get into the summer when it's tough. Like I respect anybody who's willing to go out there and not just hit the mics, but create those types of platforms for other comics. No, I think that's awesome that you were doing that. That's super commendable. And 8 months, like I said, that's 7 months and 3 weeks longer than a lot of open mics I've seen survive. So you deserve some credit there, my man.
Yeah, it was a fun little practice, and the main reason why I got that one going, I wanted to do one in Minneapolis for so long, but I just, Minneapolis sort of like my comedy high school was the scene where I sort of like learn the comedy basics, and
absolutely.
I like Minneapolis. It is sort of like comedy high school.
Yeah.
where everyone's like the pros and the beginners are sort of well integrated.
Yes. Yeah, I do think that's, I mean, obviously I can't speak to every scene. I mean, you were out in Austin, so you might be able to speak to this a little bit better than I can. I know that, there are scenes that are very clicky. And I mean, Minnesota has some of its own. Let's not,
Yep.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend there isn't cliques in the Minnesota comedy scene. But I mean, I do think that you're right. I think that overarchingly, people are very integrated. They want to help each other. They want to be, they want to contribute to the scene however they can here. If you go to a mic, you'll see people who've been doing comedy for 20 years. You'll see your Chris Maddocks, and you'll see your Gabe Noahs, and you'll see Tommy Thompsons and guys like that. And then you'll see this new group that's coming in and that's trying to figure out how to do it. And I think everybody's very supportive of each other for the most part, which is great. I mean, I think if my experience at least is if you are somebody who's committed and you want to do comedy and you want to get better, people are very, very willing to lend you advice and give you that helping hand. I think that people can sniff it out if you aren't serious or if you're not respecting the scene and things like that. But no, I mean, I do think that that's something that's really, I think that's great. And I think that's something, even kind of to cheap plug tie myself back into the book stuff. I mean, that's something that I think you saw from the early days, even, comics were always looking to kind of support each other and just make sure that if the scene gets better, we all benefit.
Yep. And another thing I want to add is like one piece of advice I want to give to comics everywhere is like, when you start a new scene, there's always going to be more people who want to help you than people who want to hurt you.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because, well, like, I think if there's more people doing comedy, there's more opportunity.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the element of competition, and I'm sure some people feel that, but also, I mean,
yeah, especially
I mean,
if you only go to Acme or House of Comedy and you think like there's these narrow spots.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the DIY culture is where it's at. I mean, people are making their own opportunities. Like, if you want to be seen and you want to get better, you can't necessarily always wait for the club to put you on that list and invest your 6 months of going and just, being seen and things like that. So, I mean, it's not to say you can't also do those things, but I think the fact that, in Minneapolis is great now. You've got the Moose Bar that does an incredible open mic on Mondays. I mean, every night there's almost a really solid DIY mic going on in town. And I think that's what I love seeing, because I think that's when you see people who really start to develop. And that's when you recognize that we're in a different era, right? Like, you don't have to wait for a club to pluck you out and say you're good enough, or you don't have to wait for a bigger comic to decide, like, oh man, I need you to be my opener. Like, you can make your own luck, which I think is cool.
Yep. Right now I think we're experiencing like another comedy boom right now, where I know on the surface it sounds like the big comedy corporations are sort of crumbling down, but now there's the smaller people who are stepping up, people who are making their own things. And they realize like, oh wait, I don't have to get hired for something. I can just go out and just declare myself like a headliner feature or even a booker now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where, you and Kelly, this better than I do, right? I mean, what kind of product you're selling to people. So, I mean, it's one of those things where, okay, if I'm booking a show and I decide, me, Patrick Strait, who's done probably 8 sets in his entire life, I'm like, yeah, I'm a headliner, and I know it's going to be terrible. I know that I'm putting that out there, and I know that it's not going to like catch on. But I also know if I'm somebody who's booking a show and I say, hey, there's a lot of really good talent, you can put together a good showcase. You can really, form your own, I don't want to say your own, you're not your own scene, but certainly your own niche, right? Where people start to recognize like, hey, this place has a good reputation with the comics. It puts up decent talent. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I think that that's something that, comics, bookers, I think everybody should take that kind of advice, that if you're waiting for somebody else to do it for you, like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not like I say comedy it's more of a hunt than a job.
Yes. That's a really good way to put it. I like that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and let's see. You said you're writing a new book. I want to ask you, like, what sort of like current events popped up in Minneapolis in recent years?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think there's, so the book that I'm working on right now is, like I said, it's predominantly focused on Acme Comedy Company and kind of its oral history that's been 33 years now, I believe they've been around. And, I mean, I think that some of those are very specific to the club, but I think some of those events are are much broader, right? I mean, I think that, you know, well, I mean, not to go all the way back into this too much, because some of this stuff was, you know, a handful of years ago. But I mean, for example, you know, like when Louis C.K. came to town, there was a lot of controversy around that. You know,
I
Acme was one
remember
of the
that.
first clubs to bring Louis to town after all of the cancellation, all of the misconduct, all the stuff that came out about that. And that was really divisive for the Twin Cities comedy scene. So, you know, the book
Yes.
really does kind of explore that from both sides. You know, what was Acme's take on it? Why did they choose to have him there? What was kind of the belief system? We talked to some of the comics, you know, there were protests when that went on.
Yep.
And we talked to some of the protesters and said, okay, what was the feeling like? And then I found some kind of, for lack of a better term, third parties who were like, you know, they understood, they maybe didn't like it, but you know, they were able to see both sides. So I think that's a really interesting one that changed a lot of the Twin Cities scene, because I think it was, you know, it was a conversation that I think probably was going to happen. It probably happens in every scene on a
Yep.
smaller, more localized level about, you know, what's considered the, you know, who polices it, I guess is the way I should say, right? So, you
Yep.
know, how people act, how people, you know, work with each other. And this was just a really grandiose example, because you had, quite honestly, who was, you know, at that point in time, the biggest comedian in the world. I mean, there was nobody bigger than Louis C.K. at that time. So you just happen to have it on the grandest possible stage with the biggest possible comics. So that was an interesting one. And then, I mean, you know, other events that have happened, you know, on a local basis here, you know, I think that it's probably been, I don't know how many years it's been now. I mean, you've had more clubs that have opened up in town. That, you know, Sisyphus Brewing in town has an incredible comedy room that has, quite honestly, I would say, you know, it's from a reputation standpoint, it's really become the number, I would say, the number 2 room in town for sure. But I mean, they're regularly selling out. They're bringing in headliners, national headliners. So the fact that you have more opportunities like that one coming about that are, you know, that's, again, like we said, not to take away from the scrappy or DIY, you know, your open mics or your shows that people are putting on, but it's nice to see other opportunities for major exposure like that coming into the Twin Cities, you know. So whether that's Acme, whether that's a House of Comedy, whether that's Sisyphus, you know, we've got a place called Camp Bar in St. Paul that does a really nice job now. You know, a lot of places they're doing that. I think that's really important. And then I guess the last thing I would say, especially in terms of talking about just current events, well, I don't know how current this is, but you know, I think that, and Kelly, you know, you're somebody I think was on the front lines of this, so you can speak to it. You know, I think that we had a very interesting changeover in the Twin Cities comedy scene coming out of the pandemic. You know, I think that going into the pandemic, there was a lot of people, and it went both ways. There was people who were super talented, so funny. You'd see them all the time. And I think the pandemic, you know, they were like, it's not worth it. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. And they went away. That being said, I think that there was opportunity that presented itself for folks who maybe wouldn't have gotten that kind of time. They wouldn't have gotten that kind of exposure, who coming out of the pandemic, they could get more stage time, they could get more exposure, and they could create their own shows that maybe that wouldn't have existed, you know, had the pandemic never happened. So that was interesting. And just, yeah, the reset, I think, in terms of what talent kind of left and who stayed and who kind of emerged, that's been really cool to see. And I think it kind of helped to kind of infuse new energy into the scene a little bit. I think that, you know, you still have the tried and true headliners. You have the folks who've been in the scene forever who are still so important, but you had these new voices that came in that you maybe wouldn't have noticed had it not been for the pandemic. So I'm really excited. I'm really happy that happened. Just to be clear, I don't want it on record that I said I'm happy the pandemic happened, but I mean, I'm happy that, you know, some people got opportunities and they were able to turn a negative into a positive.
Yep, I remember how the Minneapolis comedy scene sort of like changed during the pandemic. It was,
oh yeah,
well, not only did we have the pandemic, we also had the protests that were going on in the Twin Cities.
Yes. Yep.
And it sort of created like a psychic power pressure cooker on some performers.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it definitely, it changed the performers. And I think it also kind of just, you know, it to a degree, I think it kind of showed like who wants to be here for, you know, we talked about this earlier, you know, who's in this for the right reasons. Because if you were doing comedy during the pandemic, you weren't doing it to get famous and you weren't doing it for the money. You know, if you were doing it coming out of it, it's not because you were like, oh, this is my ticket. It's because you loved doing comedy. And I think that there were some people who maybe weren't as dedicated, or that wasn't their mindset, and the pandemic kind of, pushed them out. And I think there's people who love comedy, and I think that it gave them that chance to be a part of something. I do love that. I think that that's great, because I think that, I mean, like we mentioned earlier, there's always going to be cliques, there's always going to be clubs, there's always going to be, quote unquote gatekeeping, stuff like that. And I think the pandemic kind of, it leveled a lot of that stuff.
And one thing I want to add to that point is, and also the bonus side of like having different clubs is you can have different environments. Like you can have some clubs saying like, we want people to have this kind of comedy where it's sort of like edgy and people can be displayed, like be open about their scumminess. And we can have other clubs who say like, hey, we want to have different people come in and we want to make them feel comfortable coming in.
Absolutely.
So like the balance on the PC scale, like we can have someone go over here, someone go over there, and some clubs can have their own policies. Like, yeah, we'll have this people on, or some clubs will say like, yeah, we won't want this guy around. And
Sure.
It's sort of like a free market of what people want to go to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with you. So it is nice too, because I think that there are different stages around town where people who, at some point, whether it's like you said, whether it's because they don't like the politics, or they don't like the people, or they don't like the reputation, or whatever, there's more opportunities. You don't have to decide whether or not you get to do comedy based on those outside factors. Like if you want to do comedy, there is a place that will make you feel comfortable doing comedy. There's one I'll call out by name, Bryant Lake Bowl, that's called Uproar on Monday nights, which I believe they're actually going on hiatus for the summer. But I love those guys. Those guys are incredible, and they do a great job of, they have an open mic that is geared only towards people of color and female and gender non-binary performers. So essentially, white dudes need not apply, which, to be honest, I think is great, because I think there are a lot of people who don't get those new opportunities, and not even they don't get those opportunities, but I feel like, and this is 3 white guys sitting around saying this, so the irony is not lost on me. But I think that, you do have people who, if they show up and everybody looks like the 3 of us, they're like, all right, well, this isn't the scene for me. This isn't necessarily where I'm, feel comfortable expressing those things. So I do love that there's different places where people can express that, and they feel more welcomed, and they feel like, yeah, this is a more diverse place. Not to say that, we, the 3 social justice warriors and heroes of this podcast right now, aren't doing that, but I think that, it's the old cliche, right? I mean, representation matters, and I think it's cool that there is more of that going on.
Yep. And let's see. Oh yeah, another thing I want can give you a compliment. Like, I like how your articles are very objective. You don't go for that cheap, like, clickbait rage tactic that's so often used when reporting comedy.
Thank you. I mean, I'll say, early on, and I was doing this even when I was working with other publications, and I still do it when I work with other publications. My only goal of being this was to elevate the Twin Cities comedy scene. Like, that is my number one goal. If people think I'm a hard-hitting gotcha journalist here to crack open the Twin Cities comedy scene's like skeletons, like, that's not it. Like, you're gonna be bummed out when you listen to this podcast. That's what you came here for. Because honestly, I mean, I don't, and I think this maybe makes me either the best choice, I mean, maybe not, but like, I can be objective because I don't feel like I necessarily, my livelihood isn't contingent on this. And I can't, a lot of comics, like, you're living and dying by those relationships and what people think of you and what people are saying about you. I'm just trying to elevate the scene. I mean, if somebody is like, oh, that guy sucks, I'm not going to read his stuff anymore. Like, okay, that's fine. You guys I'm not going to lose any sleep. So I'm not feeling like I have to serve an agenda, or I don't feel like I need to, like you said, I don't need to shit on somebody here. I don't know if I can swear on this, I'm sorry, but I don't feel like I need to, to speak negatively of people, in order to get more traffic. Like, I want people, the Kelly Bergers of the world, to get their moment in the sun, because I think that the work that you do and the work that comics do, it goes unappreciated and unnoticed a lot of times. And so this is my way of hopefully giving back and kind of turning that around a little bit and letting people feel like, hey, I am being seen, like somebody is paying attention to me. And that's really what I try to do with what I write.
And I also understand like how tough it is like to report on the comedy scene, like from an outsider's perspective, because some people report on a scene, they're just going like, why is this person listed as a comedy expert?
Oh yeah.
But
I mean, that's the other thing. Yeah. Well, and I always laugh. I always say it's like when you listen to like sports talk radio guys, like the guy who's like gonna sit here and critique like, Monday morning quarterback critique everybody after like the Vikings game. Like, I don't necessarily, I don't pretend to be an expert. I don't pretend to be somebody who has that level of, well, here's why you should listen to me. But I am somebody who I believe is good at, sitting down and understanding people's motivations and why did you want to be in comedy and what makes comedy important to you and what kind of comedy do you present. And, I don't write and I don't feature people based on personal taste. I'm not like, oh, everybody who I write about is because I think they're the funniest comic in the world. Like, not the case. Some I do, but I mean, I like to look for people who I think are doing something unique, if they're doing something creative, if they're really working hard to make a positive impact on the scene, they're really working hard to try to improve their standing in the local comedy scene. That's really important to me. Like, those are the things that I look at when it's like, okay, this is who I think should get some additional press, who we should get some additional juice out there for. That's what's really important to me. And it just so happens a lot of times if you are doing all those things as a comic, you are pretty good. Like, you're getting better and you are on the rise. So, I mean, those two things go hand in hand. So, I mean, say very rarely do I feel like it's just a bunch of jabronis that I'm pulling off of open mics and being like the next comedy superstar. It's people who you're gonna see. They're working on it and they're gonna be around for a while.
Yeah, and it's tough. And one of the toughest things in comedy, like from all levels, is I'm gonna say it's like one of those things you probably shouldn't do when you're doing comedy is get into the prediction game, like who's gonna pop, who's gonna drop, and because it's very unpredictable.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've seen people who I thought were incredible comics who it just never really like they didn't get as far along as I thought they would. And I don't know if that's their own personal choices or not. Totally not to me. And I've seen some people who I scratch my head and I'm like, how in the hell is this person headlining different places? But like you said, I mean, that's not for me to try to play tastemaker and be like, oh, this is who's gonna pop and here's why. Like, I want to spotlight the people who are making a difference in the scene. And if they happen to have their moment and I can play a role in getting some eyes on them, that's awesome.
Yep. And what do you think of like some of the good qualities in like a good comedy reporter? Like,
just in a good comic in general.
I mean, quality of a good comedy reporter. Like, how would something that?
Oh, comedy report. I'm sorry, I missed the report part. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that to me, it's three things. Number one, I think it's, let me know about the person and not just them as a comic. Don't just tell me Kelly Berger makes dick jokes. Like, okay, that's great. Like, that doesn't tell me who you are. Like, tell me who they are and what's kind of what's their point of view. What is it that makes them unique? Or why do I want to listen to this person? The second thing is, I think, understanding their motivations. So talk to that comic and understand, like, hey, here's why I'm doing comedy, or here's who I like to try to speak to, or here's what type of material resonates with me. And then the third thing is kind of like back to that point is that, what are they doing that makes them stand out? So if it's a different kind of show, if it's a, I don't know, just the amount of stuff they're doing, if they're really just stretching and trying to reach a new audience, that's interesting to me. I mean, I think that the least interesting comedy report or story that you can write is about a comic who's very funny, and that's about all there is for him. There's like, yeah, they're a really funny guy, a really funny girl, and it's like, okay, we'll make them funny. You're like, well, I don't know, their material's good. It's like, okay, well, what about them? It's like, I don't really know much about them. It's okay, well, what else are they doing? They're like, well, they're hitting the mics and they're emceeing and they're starting to feature. Okay, like those reports are boring to me. Like, let me know the personalities, let me know the people.
And I also, let's say, like, the inverse can get kind of boring. Like, some reporters talk about like how some comics are toxic with their material, and that's another tough thing about journalism and like the age of like digital media, where people talk about like so and so said this on stage, when you can actually watch the tape and see what he actually said, and like how it was received in the crowd.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was turning my camera for you. No, absolutely. I mean, I think, well, and that's another thing I don't do is I don't like to review comedy. I think reviewing comedy is the dumbest thing in the entire world. I will I will preview shows, I will profile comics, but like, for me to try to sit down and say that you should listen to my opinion of how your show was or how any comic show is the dumbest thing, because comedy is so subjective. And like food. Exactly. I mean, like, again, I don't try to write based on taste. I mean, there's comics who I love who I know people are like, you actually would spend money to go see that person do comedy. I'm like, absolutely. And there's comics who I feel the same way. You know, I'm like, I wouldn't spend my money to go see them, but that doesn't mean they're not great. It doesn't mean they're not really, you know, proficient in their craft and they aren't creative and unique and things like that. I just don't necessarily, that doesn't do it for me. And I think to try to write something or base something on just that is, it's silly. I mean, that's just, come on, like, what are we doing here? Like, and the other thing, and Kelly, you can probably speak to this, you've been in the scene, is comics don't take criticism well. So
Right.
I do not want to be somebody who tries to like critique a Kelly Berger set, and all of a sudden you're just like, it obviously outwardly you get pissed, but I also don't want it to, like, to mess with somebody's psyche. I don't want it to mess with somebody who's, you had a bad show, you had a bad night. It happens. It's comedy. Like, you're not gonna have a good show every single night. So for me to try to then be like, well, on a Tuesday night at, like you said, at Grumpy's bar, Kelly just was not on his game, and now have you be like, all right, well, now the reputation is that I suck. Like, that's stupid.
Right. Yeah, I think we talked about like recent Minneapolis comedy events like the pandemic, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering if like anything's popped up in like the past 2 years where I was absent from Minneapolis.
What's been going on? Well, let's see here. I mean, mostly we've been talking about you. You have been most of the punchlines at all the open mics. It's just the shit on Kelly Berger open mic now. But no, man, I'm trying to think. I mean, I think you've seen a lot of, like I said, I mean, I think you've seen a lot of new shows that have really taken up, have really gotten legs. Whether I mentioned, like, the Moose Bar does a great open mic on Mondays, and there's an open mic on Wednesdays at the Comedy Corner Underground called Dingbats that's really great. There's a show, I mean, there's so many brewery shows, so I mean, that's just hard to even kind of try to run through. But like, I mean, there's one like Insight Brewing that is really, really great that I think well, who puts that one on? I can't remember. It's Lily Meyer and Max Chapman, I think, put that one on. Like, that's a really great one.
I've seen heard that.
Or Indeed, excuse me. Yeah, Indeed. I meant Indeed. Sorry, I knew it started with an I. So yeah, I mean, like, that's a really great one. So I think seeing some of those new shows pop up has been really good. The other thing I think is interesting, and we don't have to do too much in this, is I think you're seeing an influx of comics that are starting to come down from the Duluth area. I think you're seeing more of a Duluth influence in the Twin Cities comedy scene, which is cool because there is a lot of really good talent up there. And I think a lot of times, they kind of get overlooked, by myself included. I'll own that, because, out of sight, out of mind. So seeing some of these people has been great. There's a guy, I can't remember his last name. It starts with an O, and I'm going to butcher it if I try to, but I know his first name is Bob. He won the House of Comedy's Funniest Person with a Day Job last year. He's from Duluth. Sydney Stevens is one of the funniest people I've seen come through in a long time, and
I've heard so much about her. Like, she
great,
was on.
man.
I saw her set on Kill Tony.
Yes, yep. She did a great set on Kill Tony, and now she actually moved out to Nashville, and she's out here doing shows with Jason Mewes and all these other big names. Like, she's great, and she's from the Duluth scene. Danielle Thrillo, she's amazing, and she's done a great job up there. So it's cool seeing these people come into the scene who, maybe weren't getting the same notoriety. And I think it's just letting people know, like, hey, even, I think we feel pretty good about ourselves as the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, is saying, like, we have a really good scene. But I think it's great to be able to say Minnesota as a whole is a really good comedy state. It's cool to see more of that happening.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think I'd like to give a shout out to some of the recent Minneapolis comics who sort of like pop up on the national stage.
Yeah.
Like the big one almost everyone knows of, is Chad Daniels.
Oh, yeah. No, Chad's the best. Yeah, Chad's great. I mean, he's been doing it. He's been living in Fergus Falls, Minnesota forever, and proven that you can be a comedy superstar without having to go out to the coasts. I mean, there was just a great PBS special that aired out here that featured Ali Sultan and Ebenezer Madaza, and I can't remember who else was there, but there's a few great people who were in that one. And I mean, yeah, you're seeing just so many people who are doing incredible stuff from here. And then the other interesting thing is you're seeing comics who were from out of town who are moving to Minnesota now and are becoming, they're bringing their talents here. We're
Kelsey
Miami.
Cook.
Kelsey Cook is a great example of one. Yeah, she's out here now. I believe I don't know where Brendan Gay is from originally, but he's another one you see around town who's incredible. So I think you're seeing this interesting migration where it used to be like, well, you start in whatever market you're in, and then you move to an LA or a Chicago or a New York. And now people are moving to Minnesota. Like people are coming here for the comedy scene because they know if you really want to build your time and you want to be seen, like people are looking at Minnesota, and that's really cool to see.
Yep. And I want to give a special shout out to some other comics who are popping up nationally from Minnesota, like, for example, Mike Early, who was recently in the movie 4th of July.
Yes, I love Mike.
Yep. And then Chloe Radcliffe I'm seeing her in more stuff. I just recently saw her on After Midnight.
Dude, Chloe's a killer. She was just in an Apple series with Michael Cera and oh gosh, who else was in that show with her? But yeah, she's everywhere. She's gonna be the next superstar, which is awesome.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, I think we're almost near the end of the hour. I'm looking to my
all good.
Yeah, one of the reasons I say before, like the reason I'm doing this podcast is learn how to talk and be more human.
Well, dude, you are very human. I think you've done a great job, man. And I mean, honestly, I think this right here, this podcast is another great example of what we're talking about. Because I mean, I've seen you do comedy, and I'm not just saying this to stroke your ego. Like, I think you do a great job on stage, and I think you've done a really nice job of figuring out more ways to get your name and your face and just your voice out there. And this is a great example of that. You know, I think you are seeing people who are looking to find more avenues. I know everybody jokes that, oh, well, everybody has a podcast. And to a degree, it's true. But
yes.
Like, you've done 17 episodes. Do you know how many podcasts I've seen do one episode and then they crap out? Like, you're doing it. And I think you're a great example of how, if you're willing to just stick with it and put in the time, like it will slowly but surely happen. And, now I'm going to stroke my own ego, but no, I mean, like, honestly, and that would be my one piece of, I guess, advice for anybody who wants to do comedy writing, if anybody ever actually wants to do comedy writing. But like, I started writing these things knowing, they weren't always necessarily going to get huge traction. If I write a story about whomever I see, or whoever's got a show going on in town, it's not necessarily going to do 5,000 views. It's not going to have, it's not going to have this crazy viral nature. But, it's that consistency. It's getting that stuff out there. It's being committed to still, back to our conversation at the beginning of this podcast, it's back to that. Hey, look, if there's 6 people reading this, I'm going to write the best possible story I can for those 6 people. And I think you have to have that commitment. And I think what you're doing here and what you do in general, I mean, that speaks to it. So kudos to you, sir.
Thank you. And yeah, I think the last thing I wanted to ask was like, do you have any like suggestions for like good interview tips, like particularly guys who are doing a podcast? Wink, wink.
Yes. Look at that. That was seamless. Yes. I mean, my biggest thing, yes, I would actually love to do this. If you are somebody who is doing an interview with the media, actually, I'll say 2 things. Number 1, three things. Now I'm going to have like 14 things by the time we're done. First thing, stop being afraid of publicity. Like, there are so many comics who have this weird hang up that they can't pitch themselves, that they can't reach out to a reporter, or they can't pitch themselves to go on a podcast. Like, it's not cool to be proactive. And like, you gotta stop doing that, guys. Like, you cannot think that way. Because any business, if you're not going after it, like nobody's gonna do this for you. So I mean, that's my biggest advice. And I've had people who, they'll get weird. I'll reach out to them, I want to write a story? And they're like, well, I don't know. It feels weird to have a story about me. And I'm like, what else how do you think people are going to find out about you, man? Like, this is not the 80s. Like, you're not just going to have some producer who's going to wander into a shitty open mic and be like, wow, you're a star. Let's bring you along on the road. Like, you got to do it. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, I think, have something unique, or figure out what's memorable about you and really convey that. I think a lot of times we all get very hung up on promoting the next thing, the next show, the next podcast. But let people know about you, and that's what's going to attract people to you in the longer run. So, I mean, yes, like, obviously we want 1 billion people to listen to the Kelly Berger podcast. But if I know that Kelly is, this unique guy, this is his personality, these are the types of things that he likes to talk about and what he brings out, I'm going to get that name associated with something that I'm interested in consuming. I mean, whether that's comedy or whether that's writing or whatever the case is, like that's important. So I think focus more on conveying who you are and what makes you unique than the thing that you have coming up. Like that's great that you're Wednesday night at, Dick Bones Chuckle Hut or whatever the case is, but like, dude, tell me about you and why I should want to come see you whenever that is. And then the third thing I think is just, what's the word I want to say here? I would say be consistent is probably the easiest way to say it. And what I mean by that is, you're not always going to get, okay, if you do an open mic and you do an interview with me, or you do a showcase and you do an interview with Kelly and you get 6 people at it, like that doesn't mean that wasn't a great opportunity to get your name out there. Like people need multiple reminders. They need to hear your name and see your face multiple times before they catch on to you a lot of times. So, every podcast opportunity, every article opportunity, your world, this better than me, open mic, showcase. If you have those opportunities to talk to somebody and be interviewed by somebody, do it. Like take that 20 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, whatever it is, and make sure you have your name out there. So that would be kind of my big 3, I'll say. How's that?
Sounds good. That's a good, follows the rules of comedy, the rule of 3.
There you go. See, look at that. Look at that. I'm trying to keep it for those simple comedy brains, Kelly. I can't get too convoluted for everybody.
Yep. And okay, and the last thing is, where can people find you, Patrick?
Oh yeah, thank you. No, so I mean, yeah, like I said, mncomedy.com is my website. I update it several times a month with new interviews, new shows, new spotlight pieces. You can buy the book, Funny Thing About Minnesota. It is on Amazon or whatever your favorite book retailer is. And then, like I said, I mean, I'm always around town. I'm writing for all sorts of different places. Racket is a place I write for regularly. That's racketmn.com. I do work for them. I'll do work for, I feel like most people shut down. Once I start writing comedy for you, you shut down. But, anything that's Twin Cities publications that talks about comedy, you're going to find me there. So yeah, mncomedy.com, and I'll link from there.
And I look forward for your next book coming out. What's it called? The History of Acme?
Yeah, I believe the official title is going to be still pending, but I believe it's going to be called Home Club, the oral history of Acme. So yes, I'm looking forward to that. Probably sometime late next year.
I look forward to reading it, and I will take the time to read it and not have my brother read it first.
Honestly, I'll have Darren read it, and he can give you the highlights at least. So the next time we do this, you can pretend that you read it. There you go.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you for being here, Patrick. It was great talking with you. Being the first official civilian and book author on the podcast.
Hey man, I'm proud to be the first civilian, and hopefully the next one is much worse than me. So by comparison, I look like I was a real slam dunk first timer.
Thank you.
I'm always rooting against I'm trying to set the bar lower. That's what I'm trying to do, Kelly. I don't want your show to get better. I want it to get worse, so that you're like, man, that Patrick Strait episode, that's when we peaked. So
yeah, this is when.
There you go. But no, man, this is great. Thank you so much. And anytime, I would love to chat with you about your shows, what you got going on, the podcast, anything. Reach out anytime, and let's connect.
All right. And I think that's where we're going to clip it.
Perfect.
Berger out.